Hello, everyone. My name is Mahendra Rao, and I'm really happy to be a participant in this session, which is on India and the regenerative medicine field. I'm going to try to give you an overview of the entire field and leave it to my colleagues who are part of this session to provide you with additional details. So this is my first slide, and all I want to do is highlight a few things here. What you see on the right here is that the field in India looks very much like the field in the rest of the world. Just like regenerative medicine includes working with dead cells, tissues, scaffolds, devices, and organs, there are companies which do that in India. There are companies which work on HSC, cord blood, MSC, NSC, and all other cells. And there's a small amount of work that is being done on pluripotent stem cells as well. I'm going to try and tell you why some of these things are different in India as compared to what's been happening in the United States. What you see on the left here are the points that I'm going to try to make. The stem cell market in India, despite the size of the country, is not that large. This is from a report, and you can download that report. It says it's maybe about 470 million over the next 4 or 5 years. The companies that have been listed as being important in the field are listed here, some of them, and I'll talk to you about the newer companies in the next few slides. Reliance was the big boy in the field, but its activity has been quite diminished in the last few years. And many of these other companies that you see listed here are companies which do banking services, and there's been a big change in banking as well. And there are two companies which I want to highlight in my next few slides. One of them is Therapeutics, which works on MSC, and the other is iStem, which works on eye-related technologies. The field entirely has been guided a large extent by how the regulators have viewed work in India. And I'll encourage everybody to read what's been listed in this slide deck as in a presentation done by Dr. V.G. Somani, who is the head of DGCI, which is the equivalent of the FDA in India. There's a standard regulatory framework for stem cells and product review in India, and I can't go through all the details, but I encourage you to look at that section. I just want to highlight the kinds of work that people are doing. Perhaps the largest work that's being done is really what I would call a Me Too type of therapy. You import an existing approved therapy under a standard model, and that's what's listed as importers on the right. You also have indigenous manufacturers, and these are few, and they have to go through more hoops than if you're importing an existing technology, simply because the regulators in India lack the experience and they're far more comfortable relying on approvals that have already occurred in other countries and focusing just on adding the limited additional information that will be required to approve the product in India. There is a special banking section, and I just want to point out that since the last 2 years, banking of anything other than cord blood has been banned, and a lot of the companies which had started have now had to cease activity. The last section that I have here, which I want to highlight, is that to support all of this activity, one needs to think about how research is conducted in India and how it's regulated. And I'll just say that India has always been famous for red tape, and this is no exception. There are several committees and apex committees which are required, approval from whom is required. And as a result, it's not that easy to do so. Nevertheless, there are several institutes which have taken a lead in providing stem cell-based research. One of them is InStem, where I've been fortunate to have been a visiting faculty member for many years. So I want to just summarize certain things here from what I just showed you from the slide deck from Dr. Somani. That is that for new drug products, including biologicals discovered in India, a clinical trial is required. For new drugs approved outside India, only phase 3 studies need to be carried out to generate evidence of efficacy and safety. And that's why it's much easier to be able to import a drug and get it approved in India. Approval of new drugs can be short-circuited or done in a more rapid fashion, much like you can do in other countries. And that is if there are an adequate number of Indian patients as part of a global clinical trial, and the drug is also approved in other countries, or we may have these shortcuts based on life-threatening diseases, or if they may not, if there's such that it's considered to be of essential use, or there is already certain data that has already been obtained in other localities. So what are the implications of these regulations? The implication of these regulations in India has been that academic research is active. Many trials are investigator-initiated and have been approved as long as they've gone through the regulatory hoops that are required in India. However, there is no easy mechanism to translate that activity by investigators into commercial activity by companies. Hospitals have been the active proponents of initiating studies, and this is because getting funding both from pharma or from investing houses has been difficult. Hospitals have experts and they have the ability to run clinical trials, and they've often been the active proponents because of the physicians' commitment to initiating new studies, and they've taken the lead in many of the clinical trials that have been done in India. As I pointed out before, it's much easier to import a product, run a clinical trial with a hospital, and get approval as opposed to developing everything in-house. So therefore, the focus has been on short-term bets, the fast follower type of therapies, rather than truly innovative novel therapies. In the next few slides, I'm just going to give you examples of some of the companies that have been able to make a success and some academic centers whom you might want to consider working with because of their success in being able to navigate the system in India. First, with academic success. Perhaps the best known is L.V. Prasad Eye Institute, which is based out of Hyderabad, and that has focused on the eye, and in particular on limbal stem cells, and that was work that was done by Dr. Sanwan and Geeta Vembugutta, and they were able to treat several hundred patients and then file for clinical trial approval, both in India and also in the United States. And what you see listed there is the clinical trial registration on the FDA site. I won't go into details. You're welcome to go to the site or download the slide deck to be able to get additional details. The second group I'd like to highlight is CMC Vellore, or Christian Medical College Vellore, and in particular, Dr. Alok Srivastav, who heads the Center for Stem Cell Research, which is based out of there. They have focused on bone marrow transplant and then looking at doing clinical studies for hemophilia and other such hematological disorders where they believe that they can add novel adenoviral therapy and CRISPR gene editing so as to be able to treat these disorders. It's important to note that in India, this is a really large number of patients, and any solution would be a godsend. This work is ongoing, and we look forward to seeing how this will be approved. As I pointed out before, it's been hard for them to translate this to a commercial activity. Nevertheless, these clinical trials and partnerships are welcome. The next company I want to tell you is also related to doing it in the hematological system. And this has really been really exciting for me personally because this is completely homegrown. Dr. Rahul Pawar, who used to be an academic at Harvard, moved back to India to IIT Bombay, and he decided that he'd want to try to develop a low-cost T-cell therapy. Recall what I told you, that it's easier to do something which is already approved abroad. But in his case, he decided that he would generate his own CAR and develop his own manufacturing process and use it as an autologous therapy. He has gotten approval, and they've run a clinical trial with hospital partners, and he was able to attract funding and set up a company which is called ImmunoAct. This is their pipeline of products. I emphasize this to point out that there is expertise. People can do this sort of work, but it really takes a lot of initiative and drive to be able to do this. And partnering with such companies may be an easier way for external companies to be able to enter the Indian market than it is to go it alone. The other company is Therapeutics. You probably all have heard of it. Therapeutics is one of the few companies in the world which has obtained approval for an MSC-based product. And they have obtained approval not just in one indication, but in 2 indications. And they've been able to license it to a pharma partner in terms of Alchem and Cipla. Their idea was to make a pooled MSC product And that allowed them to obtain certain IP and also allowed them to make their product robust and more consistent. And that's allowed them to treat a large number of patients. They, of course, also have a cosmeceutical line based on MSC-based conditioned media and a hair growth product and a device to be able to automate the process of manufacturing MSC. The last company I'd like to really talk about is a company called iStem. iStem is an iPSC-focused company, and this is due to the vision of a single founder by the name of Jogin Desai. And their goal was to develop cutting-edge therapy and make it available at a relatively low cost in India. For a variety of reasons, they have focused on the eye, most importantly because the number of cells required is relatively small, and that means that one could develop efficiencies and be able to manufacture at a relatively straightforward cost in India. They currently have made their own master cell bank, and they have done their animal studies and have gotten approval for initiating clinical trials in India. However, they've not yet done any human studies. This is their platform. This is their direction of work. And the last thing that you see at the bottom there is work in the lungs. And this just highlights how companies can extend their technology. Once they made a master cell bank for iPSC, they knew that they could use it as starting material to make other cell types. And in their case, they had expertise in making alveolar epithelial cells. And so they've been looking at that. And they did get some money to be able to look at alveolar epithelial cells and the use of those cells in treatment of COVID-related acute respiratory distress syndrome. I don't know where that has gone, given how things got shut down during the COVID time. But nevertheless, this has been a really active and attractive direction for the company. They've recently raised funding, and so it'll be interesting to see what they do next. The last piece I wanted to tell you about was something that makes India a little bit unique, and it's both a challenge and a risk. Once you have a company, once you can get approval, once you have the technology and you can manufacture, you need to have a manufacturing infrastructure that can make drugs, not just for the Indian market, but can make it for worldwide use. And India has been lucky that it had a very strong organic chemistry background and was able to be a leader in generic drug manufacture. And I just point out some of the highlights from newspapers that are there. This was something in Bloomberg which said, the US drug supply is even more reliant on India than we thought. And that what you see here is a graph from there, which says that more than 50% of generic drugs are manufactured in India. And there have been some issues with that, both pluses and minuses. It means there's a large infrastructure. It also means that the US FDA monitors it directly, and it means that there's a lot of expertise that's available. However, though you are strong in small molecule manufacture, it doesn't mean you're strong in everything. And that's what we've noticed, is that India's manufacturing is not as strong in biologics, but it's getting there. And there are companies like Sun Pharma, Dr. Reddy's Lab, Biocon, which have moved in that direction from the generic manufacturing field. However, there's still quite significant weakness in viral and stem cell and mRNA products. And I would call on CDMOs who are interested in partnerships that this would be an open area of partnership in India. Two examples of companies which are doing this sort of manufacture are Anthem Biosciences and Chemwell. And I'd look forward to you guys looking up what they do and how you could work with them. So I'd just like to summarize here then that, in my opinion, the field in India is small. It's somewhat starved for capital. Pioneers and trailblazers have had an impact by building on existing strengths. It's been the hospitals or people with a single vision who've been able to do things, but there hasn't been a standard pipeline of biopharma and bioincubation that you see in many other countries. The government, hospital, and pharma see this as an opportunity to provide lower cost autologous therapies, and the government has actually introduced new funding programs. So this is a place which is ripe for opportunity. Nevertheless, issues remain. And while I've not discussed them in detail, these include one big issue, which is getting healthy donors and sufficient numbers of samples. There's a big infrastructure issue just in shipping and logistics, which has to be solved if this has to become routine. There is a lack of QC and validation paradigms and companies dedicated to providing that, and an approval process for validated QC tests, because the DGCI itself does not have a very clear-cut mechanism for approval of such tests. And there's no easy licensing system for transferring technology from academia to companies. Companies have really focused on an export market or on importing and getting approval of an already existing product and then re-exporting it. And they're only now looking inwards to seeing whether there is profit in the Indian market. So this represents a potential marketing and partnership strategy and an exciting investment opportunity for companies and investment agents outside the country. And manufacturing could be a hidden strength in India from which they could build, much like the hospitals have already been identified as a big strength. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'll be happy to take questions in this virtual session.